I believe that had the Axis won the Second World War, there would be a big economic crash, as in the previous 2 episodes I explored how the Axis could win and what this would mean for the world going forwards, exploring most countries in detail. Where I left off, I told you that Germany's economy relied heavily on looting, slave labor and racial extermination. So, while this worked out for the Germans economically that they invade countries, steal their resources and invade more countries, they had already won the war, so there is nobody left to conquer. Italy is an obstacle of Germany, but let's be real, the Italian economy and their sphere are the strongest, and since the Germans have landed on the US East Coast, consolidating power over it rather than going to war with Italy would be a smarter choice, as the US East Coast has more resources and population than the Italian sphere. Germany would for now consolidate control over their new subjects, which would be especially difficult in Reich's Commissariat Moscovian, where the local population is for sure going to rebel heavily, so it would become a resource drain for the Germans. Further, in the previous episode, I explored how Generalplan Ost was expected to cost 60 billion Reichsmarks, which is equivalent to the entirety of the German economy in 1941, and it was supposed to be completed in 25 years. This is obviously very optimistic by the ultranationalist Germans, and I want to tell you why this likely crashes the German economy, as so many negative factors would bundle up and make it become inevitable. If Generalplan Ost were to be completed in 25 years, I would say this would cost Germany around 4% of their GDP per year until completion. While this could seem as negligible, I'm going to say that this plan was drastically underestimated regarding how much it would actually cost, as it originally didn't account for the build-up of railways and highways as to connect these Reichskommissariats to Germany, and make it much more easier for Germany to consolidate their rule and prevent any uprisings, having a more centralized system. I can easily see this plan taking around 10% of their GDP until completion, which is to say that it's going to be extremely costly. Germany is going to spend a lot of money on military as well, as it was part of their pride and ultranationalist ideology for the men to serve in the army and protect the Reich. The problem for the Germans is that there is no longer enemies to fight, so continuing to militarize, funding science programs to develop better weapons and so on would be in my opinion very counterproductive, yet the ultranationalist Germans would do it anyways. I can say with confidence that around 25% of the German GDP would be spent on military and science as to bolster the army, which also includes rocket research. And further we can add the cost of their Generalplan Ost, and neither of these two things would actually grow the German economy. Sure, Generalplan Ost would provide Germany with a lot of cheap labor and resources, but this is simply not sustainable, and considering how the Germans wanted to remove one way or the other about 150 million people, you can see how this could quickly backfire. At least 35% of the German GDP is not going to places that would grow the economy for a duration of 25 years. And I think that this is a simple recipe for disaster, and I'm sure that there would be an economic crisis. There has to be one with this amount of unproductive spending. Further, with no Jewish, Slavic and other targeted populations, skilled workers would vanish from the Reich. Of course, Germany had many skilled workers themselves, but by all means the Reich is overstretched, and these German skilled workers cannot be everywhere all at once. Meaning that, for example, Reichskommissariat Ukraine would see their grain production halve in the coming years. After all, the Germans plan to eliminate half of the local population, and the Germans flowing in wouldn't be enough to replace them, so these Reichskommissariats are going to provide Germany with less resources than expected, while costing about 35% of the German GDP as to maintain them. Here is my prediction as to what could have happened next: economic stagnation, shortages and corruption. Regarding economic stagnation, I think it's inevitable, let me explain. The German economy is starting to demilitarize and transition into a civilian economy, yet they would spend more money on consolidating their newly conquered lands, which would be more trouble than it's worth. Veterans would return from the war in the millions, so there would be a shortage of housing and other resources like cars. As such, these veterans may be forced that instead of going back to Germany with their families, are incentivized to go to the conquered lands and occupy a house, as the previous owners would be gone. Practically all of the Reichskommissariat's villages would become ghost towns, as what I mentioned in Ostland, for example, 80% of their pre-war population was planned to no longer live there, so you can assume that millions of Germans settling in these villages isn't going to be too productive, instead of being in the big cities and making more money. What I'm trying to say, despite being no economist myself, is that I think the demand for goods would go down in Germany, as they had conquered so much land, houses and resources, as such giving them to the German people, that these people, like Werner Koch for our own story, have all of their needs fulfilled. Some German citizens would focus on getting luxury goods, which the Reich didn't produce before, while others would be content what they already have, and their economic impact would only go down. For example, Werner Koch moved to Warsaw in a home previously owned by a Polish national, who no longer exists. He likely gets out of land as well, and since Germany is starting to produce luxury goods, there is basically nothing that Werner Koch would actually want to buy, nor need, as he already got a home and land for free. Can you see how millions of Germans getting what they want for free would decrease economic activity, while also Germany is spending the bulk of their money on keeping the Reichskommissariats in check, and they even wouldn't be profitable, so this could create a total disaster. Let us say that in 1939 the German economy starts to stagnate, and this would immediately cause some problems. There would be lots of inflation, as Germany would want to stimulate economic activity, and by printing money they can incentivize the people to spend their savings or risk losing them. I can assume that black markets are going to become quite common in Eastern Europe, where basic goods would start to lack, but also this would fuel the resistance and German resentment in the region. I haven't touched the resistance just yet, but of course they wouldn't sit idle. Peter, the resistance fighter for our own story, has been hiding under Warsaw, hoping to overthrow the general government and establish a free Poland. What the resistance fighters would see is that Poland is almost directly controlled by Germany and quite close to the German mainland, so starting an uprising there would be a total disaster. Instead, all resistance fighters around Eastern Europe would collaborate, regardless of religion or ethnicity, as they all have the same struggle, which is German occupation. Muscovian is quite vulnerable, as it is the most Slavic population and heavily forested and underdeveloped, being the ideal breeding ground for a revolution to start. All resistance fighters would be in agreement that they must all rise together. If they don't coordinate, they would all die trying one by one. All resistance fighters would plan for a great uprising, but would wait and see when the time is right. With the economic stagnation and later economic collapse of Germany, this time may come sooner than anticipated. As you can clearly see, there would be a lot of growing unrest in the superstate, with corruption being the main problem for Germany. This is because individuals would be selected first by their race and their competency second, so you can see how at least some incompetent Germans would end up as factory owners in the east or doing administrative tasks, which would further slow down input. What I'm trying to say is that everything based on the ultranationalist ideology to me looks like a terrible long-term economic plan. While all of this inflation and stagnation is going on, Germany would partially destroy Berlin and Albert Speer would be tasked with redesigning a new megacity called Germania. Now you don't need to know a lot about this, but I will tell you that this would be very ambitious, like Generalplan Ost. The Germans would also underestimate the costs, and even the slave labor they would be using would prove to be too costly either way. This is mainly due to the soil of Berlin, which was unsuitable for mass structures, and the ultranationalists wanted to build structures the size that were never seen before at the time. This is not a matter of resources and manpower, but rather physics, which the Germans would have a very hard time changing, making their efforts of building Germania several times more costly than anticipated. We can now say that for the sake of argument, about 40% of the German spending wouldn't go to any area that would grow the economy for a total duration of 25 years, while economic output would go down, so yeah, the Reich wouldn't be doing too great internally. So, with my predicted German economic stagnation, which would later turn into an economic contraction, what does this actually look like, and would this result in growing instability? Before I answer that, let me tell you how this would affect the major Axis powers of Italy and Japan. For sure, they would be impacted, but perhaps not as much. Let me explain. Mussolini's empire was already weak and inefficient. One alternative is that Italy could get dragged on into this mess, as Germany would demand tribute to be paid, in exchange for not invading, as Germany would like to ease pressure off, and pulling their former allies is one way to achieve that. The problem is that Italy compared to Germany was very rural and their factories and agriculture were very outdated, so there is no way for the Italians to compete with Germany in Europe. The thing is that Mussolini neither wanted to seriously modernize nor to rely on Germany, so unless something is done quickly in Italy, they would become a junior partner of Germany. Basically, the goal of Italy was to create a self-sufficient society, but the problem is that the colonies and lands that they had just gained aren't going to be profitable for a while, as the cost of administration would outweigh the benefits of the resources gained. Italy may be forced to give more autonomy to their subjects, installing loyal ultranationalists rather than consolidating full control, which looks totally unlikely. As I previously mentioned, Greece and the Arabs would resist this Italianization of their lands, so the main problem becomes that Italy is also much like Germany, stagnating and fighting a costly guerrilla war as to keep their gains. You can say that for the Axis, the battle for survival is just starting, and the worst is yet to come. Mussolini's regime might lose legitimacy after there is no more enemies to conquer, and the people are faced with more problems than before the war. Since the position of Mussolini was never truly great and strongly secured, somebody overthrowing him is entirely in the realm of the possibilities. But let me tell you about Japan as well, then I can explore what will change in the world with this economic stagnation. The Japanese actually have the resources needed from their subjects as to keep themselves afloat, and there is definitely a room to grow. But the problem is that Japan is practically overly reliant on their colonies, most of which aren't even loyal at all. Japan would know that if they were to lose the southern resource area, that their empire is doomed to collapse, so Japan would grow paranoid and exterminate people who pose a threat to the regime. Over time, Japan might even distance itself from ultranationalism as to gain more legitimacy as Asia's true leader, but also if they liberalize, this could keep the empire afloat, rather than risk collapsing it by continuing the status quo. The main problem for the Japanese empire is China, as the Chinese have the fate of the Japanese empire in their hands, as if they rise up before the Japanization efforts start to kick in, this would become 100 times worse than the Vietnam War in our own history, collapsing the Japanese empire over time, as this war would become too costly to maintain, not to speak of achieving total victory again. It's fair to say that Japan is also very overstretched, but the economic downturn in Germany wouldn't concern Japan all that much. In fact, it may prove as a wake-up call as to change their leadership and approach. This is to say that Japan may see how ultranationalism is starting to fail in Europe, so they may start to distance themselves from it in order to maintain the empire. Japanese science and engineering were also relatively advanced, so them developing a nuclear bomb isn't too impossible, but since one was never used during the Second World War, it would take a while for Japan to realize the full potential of the nuclear bomb. Technically, as of right now, the United States of America is the only country that has the nuclear weapon, but it was never officially tested and the Americans cannot produce too many of them, so still nuclear weapons aren't popular in the world, with Germany potentially starting their nuclear program more seriously after the victory. For the sake of argument, I would say that Germany gets their nuclear weapons in 1950, Japan does in 1953, and Italy would get them in 1958 if they survive this far into the future. Regarding the Italian nukes, they will take a different approach from the rest of the Axis, as they are likely going to be small yacht bombs, used to enforce control in Europe and the Mediterranean, not to be intercontinental rockets used to fight distant wars, while for Japan and Germany this may be a necessity. Italy almost has no resources needed to develop a nuke, but I think that they would partner up with Japan and absorb some fleeing German scientists. Now you may be confused as to why I shifted the topic to nuclear weapons, but I think it makes sense for the Axis as to consolidate control over their vast lands, as they are all very overstretched. A nuclear weapon could instill fear into the Axis subjects and eliminate hundreds of thousands of resistance fighters with one strike, so it would become more cost effective than fighting a guerrilla war, which all of the Axis would be internally fighting, costing them economic growth and them needing to maintain a larger army. Basically, I'd say that the Axis would try to instill fear into their conquered lands, which would make it easier for them to control, and nuclear weapons is the best way to achieve this. Going back to how this would actually change the world in the 1950s, Werner and Nadia for our own story would start to find life a little more difficult. There would be a shortage of almost anything luxury that they could ever want, and remember, all their basic needs are covered by the Reich. For example, cars is one such luxury. The German military companies could practically switch to making cars, but tanks are still required as to fight rebels around the world, so there would be a shortage of cars, considering the empire size is pretty much guaranteed. This reminds me of the Soviet Union, where there was a waiting list to get a car. You pay for it and in about a decade you may receive your vehicle, as the Soviet Union had similar problems as Germany right now regarding their civilian production. Of course, I do think that this alternate Germany would do better in cars production than the Soviet Union historically, but still the German sphere is far greater than the one of the Soviet Union. What this situation reminds me of the Soviet Union's economy, which while strong on paper had lacked basic goods for most of their people. We all know what eventually happened to the Soviet Union, and I'm sure that the same would happen to this alternate Germany, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Alright, let me talk about something more interesting than cars, economies and shortages. Let's talk about religion. No wait, this is actually interesting, trust me. German ultranationalism view Catholicism as a threat and an obstacle to their ambitions. The German ultranationalists didn't like a non-government force having influence over their people, similarly to the totalitarian Soviet Union and how religion was treated there. I can absolutely see Germany to limit Christianity, starting with the Catholic branch, which was the least present in the Reich. The ultranationalist Germans wouldn't want the basically Italian Pope to meddle with what his people can think. The Austrian painter himself was born a Catholic, but despised Christianity. To tell you the extent of this, the Austrian painter very much liked Islam and wished it had spread to Europe during the Muslim conquest of the continent. He liked Islam because it was very controlling and radical, and these are not my words, but his. As such, if we ever make a Hearts Fire and 4 mod regarding this series, there could be a meme part of Germany going Islamic in the 1950s, which is a narrow possibility, but hey, the chances are precisely never zero. Jokes aside, as I alluded in the previous episode, Italy would become even more Catholic-oriented as to differentiate themselves from Germany, but also get France on their side, with Spain and Portugal also being very Catholic and could be nice allies of Italy. I can see the Italians to grant more privileges to the Pope and the Catholic Church as to appease their people, who would be feeling the brunt of the economic stagnation, and this move of appeasing the masses I think would make sense. Here is what I find really interesting. In terms of religion, the German sphere controls all of the Protestant areas, with the Italian sphere controlling most of the Catholic ones. In terms of orthodoxy, the former Soviet Union is obviously a big one, but they are in the German sphere and the Germans are guaranteed to restrict orthodoxy and try to eliminate this branch of Christianity. Germany is for sure going to be atheist, so the only independent Orthodox nations would be Bulgaria and Romania. Serbia also exists, but in this alternate history are basically a failed state, and I alluded that there could be a possible partition of the nation. Greece and Montenegro are obviously very orthodox countries, but they are not independent and are part of the Italian sphere, with Ethiopia being in the same position. Regardless, Bulgaria and Romania are the only true independent orthodox countries, and this could mean that they can reshape their branch of Christianity however they'd like. I think that Bulgaria and Romania are going to be much more closely aligned with Italy, as the Slavic Bulgarians would fear what is happening to Eastern Europe, with tens of millions of Slavs being eradicated, while Bulgaria never really supported the Axis, but purely joined them as to not get invaded. Romania on the other hand was a very much committed Axis member, but they disapproved of the Hungarians gaining even more Romanian lands during the Second Vienna War. And now in this alternate history the Germans had puppeted Hungary in the previous episode. While I can see Romania working with Germany more closely due to the Romanian oil still being needed by the Germans, I would say that they would prefer to work with Italy if they had a choice. What I find really interesting about this situation is that orthodoxy may cease to exist, and Bulgaria and Romania, wishing to get away from the German sphere, could align themselves to Italy by becoming Catholic themselves. This is a really interesting butterfly effect I have never heard anybody mention, and I don't blame them, as who could have expected the possibility of Bulgaria and Romania going Catholic would increase had the Axis won the Second World War. This is the type of butterflies I want to find and share with you. Now Albania is sort of an independent country, being in a personal union with Italy, but I have them be basically the Italian color as this better reflects the situation on the ground. I think that Albania becoming Catholic is also an increased possibility, and while unpopular in the country would only bring them closer to the Italian sphere and one step closer to a total annexation. Greece and Montenegro are in a very similar positions. If Bulgaria and Romania switch to Catholicism, which would have happened in this alternate history, then Greece and Montenegro are the only Orthodox nations, but they are under the boot of the Catholic Italians, who also may force them to switch their religion, with the help of Bulgaria and Romania as mediators. I would have Orthodoxy to officially die in the year of 1954, as all former Orthodox countries would start to get united by religion and stand strong against the atheist Germans committing unspeakable acts in Eastern Europe. Now this change would be unpopular in the Balkans, and there is for sure going to be some insurgency and protests, but I think that they would mostly be crushed. Greece would rebel even harder, but the Italians are going to occupy the majority of the cities, so eventually this Greek rebellion would prove to be unsuccessful. Really quickly I want to mention Croatia. They are mostly Catholic, and now with this move they would eliminate the Orthodoxy within their lands, which I think would stabilize the country. Basically this move is beneficial for all independent Orthodox countries, but very bad for the Orthodox countries under the boot of Italy, or Croatia, or even Turkey. In Cyprus the Greek Orthodoxy would initially thrive, but I don't think that this would remain the case for too long. With Turkey pursuing policies of ethnic cleansing, the Greeks in Cyprus are going to be resettled or forcefully converted, so this would be the official death of Orthodoxy. There is also the Armenians and Georgians being Orthodox Christians, which would see the same fate as the Greeks in Cyprus, total assimilation one way or the other. I would say that by the year of 1955, or realistically even sooner, there is going to be a German-Italian split. They had signed the Pact of Steel in 1939, and it lasted for 10 years, so it would end in 1949. I don't think that this pact would be renewed, as both ultranationalist giants had started to differ quite a lot in terms of leadership and approach to conquered people. Germany would grow to be really hostile to Italy, potentially demanding tribute for them in order to preserve the status quo. Germany wouldn't like how Italy is influencing other countries with religion. Furthermore, Germany didn't see the Mediterranean people too positively, so such a split is only natural and inevitable. Germany holds out of Catholic populations, such as in Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, Austria, south of Germany, including Switzerland, the Rhineland, including Luxembourg and parts of France, and even the Reichskommissariats of Belgium and parts of Ostland, and even the entirety of Hungary, which is now a German puppet, are all Catholic people. I think that there would be a mass killings of Catholics within the German realm, as to limit the Italian influence over them, with churches being destroyed en masse and priests being prosecuted, jailed and being sent to labor camps. The German realm is going to become slowly more atheist and limit non-government interference, with ultranationalist propaganda being the only thing that the people would be allowed to consume. By this point, Germany would have developed an impressive nuclear arsenal, and this fear of total annihilation would keep their subjects intact. The Germans' fear is increasingly becoming more dark. Further, Germany is going to dislike Italy for one more reason, and this is the same why the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia split up, and later the Soviet Union and China. Basically, Germany would see the Italian ultranationalists as competition, and thus Germany wanted total control over the ultranationalist ideology. As such, they would be very hostile to Italy and support the Croatian irredentist claims, as Germany wants to be the only ultranationalist country in the region, reshaping the ideology to their own liking, and not having any competitors. Italy is going to prove an obstacle to German ambitions. With both economies failing, Germany would likely subjugate Italy, having some influence over the nation, and extract concessions. There would be German troops on the Italian border, as to motivate the Italians to act more in Germany's favor. There is the possibility of Germany forcefully improving the Italian industry, which would help Germany extract more concessions from the Italians if this is the case. I would leave this up for interpretation for now, but I think that the Italians' fear would be doomed if they don't do anything quickly, as expansionist Germany is eyeing them up as to ease their economic pressure back home. Now I have not covered too many wars, but I think that there would be definitely some, just not in Europe. Starting off with Asia, Japan has created a puppet government in India called Azad Hind, led by Subhas Chandra Bose. The thing is that Azad Hind would continue fighting the remnants of India, as Bose wanted to unite all of India under his regime, and wouldn't stop until he has achieved this goal. Free India is now more prepared for this, but they are practically surrounded by Japanese allies and puppet states, so the country would spend a lot more money and resources on their military as to keep the Japanese influence out. This front line is going to become really bloody and advances would be very slow. For the duration of this series, this war is going to be permanent and ongoing, with millions more people dying. For now, I would have Azad Hind to expand from the south near the Krishna river, which could serve as a natural defensive line. The thing is that this territory captured is one of the least populated in India, due to geography and harsh weather conditions. So while it may look impressive, Free India still has the bulk of their population up north around the Ganges river. Some more wars that would be taking place are Argentina becoming ultranationalist oriented and possibly invading Chile. The two countries have always had issues with their borders not being clearly defined. While Argentina has taken out the Falkland Islands and South Georgia Island, they could be looking to reach the Pacific Ocean and restore La Plata. Brazil, on the other hand, is likely going to become also very ultranationalist, with Peru and Venezuela already being ultranationalist themselves, so there would be a continent full of ultranationalist countries looking to expand their influence at the expense of others. Without the United States of America acting as peacekeepers in the region, I think it's fair to say that many wars would definitely start. Not just Argentina and Chile would be going to war, but potentially Peru restart their war against Ecuador as to fully conquer the country, under the pretext of protecting them from radical Colombia, while Brazil is likely to go to war against Uruguay, which used to be part of the first Brazilian Empire. Bolivia is a weird one. They had lost the Chaco War to Paraguay in 1935. So with the changing world order, they may be looking to retake the Chaco province with a war and restore their national pride, potentially also collaborating with Argentina as well as to regain their coastline, which to me looks very likely. South America is finally interesting, and in the following episodes I would cover how each of these wars would go. Going back to Europe, and more specifically Germany, by the late 1950s, the Germans would have developed an impressive arsenal of rockets, which would help them launch the first satellite into space. I think that the ultranationalists are going to be obsessed with space travel, as they wanted to spread the German race around the world, and now they could set their sights at making a permanent colony on the moon, which would be another long-term goal. To put it simply, Lebensraum on Earth wouldn't be enough, so they would be looking to colonize all of space. While the launch of the first satellite and potentially unmanned mission into space would certainly boost the national pride of Germany, I already covered how the German economy is struggling, and now even more money would flow into space research, while the quality of life of the common German people would start to drop. But due to the ultranationalist propaganda and secret police, their population would be kept in check. By now, Generalplan Ost is in full force and has been active for about a decade, so plenty of people from Eastern Europe would have been deported or eliminated in other ways. While the Germans don't have the majority in any of their conquered territories, this will change in the next decade. The local populations of the Reichskommissariats would see the writing on the wall, so a resistance would form, who would seek to kick the Germans out, and with the poor economy of the Reich, in addition to the poor health of the Austrian painter, this moment may come sooner than expected. All of Eastern Europe is getting ready for a full-scale rebellion, waiting for the right time. Going over quickly to the Siberian nations, they would start receiving migrants that were deported by the Germans from Eastern Europe, and since the lands beyond the Urals are very harsh, there would be mass starvation. I can absolutely see this to cause plenty of wars in the region, with the remnants of the Soviet Union based in Omsk potentially expanding, but their successes would be cut short. The Euro republics, which were more democratically oriented, would unite and not allow migrants to flow into the Soviet Union, which over time would make the Euro republics the strongest Russian countries in the region, due to them receiving the bulk of the migration and in terms of population. Over time I can see the Euro republics to expand with a really bloody and prolonged conflict to finally defeat the Soviet Union and start a campaign of removing communist symbols, ideology and sympathizers. The rest of the Siberian nations are mostly made up of indigenous people, who seeing the Japanese extermination in the Far East, may choose to democratically join the Euro republics, who now would create the Democratic Russian Republic, with Tomsk likely becoming the nation's capital, as it is the largest city in the entire nation. In terms of population, the Democratic Russian Republic would be about 20 million people, but once we start counting in the fact that Germany wanted to deport 50 to 60 million Russians beyond the Urals, their population would increase drastically. While the first decade of these warlord states were brutal, eventually once they were united into a single country, they would start to prosper and their economy would grow rapidly. Looking at this map of the total areable land in Russia, we can see that the country would be really densely populated to the south, with a rough line between Omsk and Novosibirsk being where 80% of the population would reside. These cities would expand and become megapolises, and a beacon of stability in the region, who would be forced to modernize and produce a lot of food. While life would be generally improving in the Russian democratic country, the Russian state would be considerably poorer than you may imagine, and they are in no position to either challenge Japan nor Russia. The Germans and Italians are going to see how this economic stagnation could destroy their empires, so they need to do something drastic as to reverse this trend in order to maintain their hegemony. As such, I think that they would start constructing some mega projects, one of which was Atlantropa, which had the aim to drain the Mediterranean Sea and create more land to settle, but also the Breitspurbahn, which was a railway so big that it was planned to have cinemas and swimming pools inside of the trains. In the next episode, I would explore the ultranationalist mega projects planned to be made after they were victorious, which would happen in this alternate universe as to distract the people from their worsening domestic situation. Check out the video on the screen and I hope to see you there. Goodbye.